Hello, my name is Sarah Sherrod, and I'm the Executive Director of Stand With Us UK, and I'm extremely proud and honoured that we're hosting the UK book launch of Isresilience. Despite COVID, the book is making its way around the world and gathering huge critical acclaim, with endorsements from luminaries such as Senator Joe Lieberman and our much missed and adored late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. It is a must-read, and may I suggest with a tissue. Tonight's event will last around 45 minutes, and below you will see how you can pose a question to our panel. You will also see that there is a donate button. Michael and Naomi have kindly signed 50 copies of Isresilience, which we will send to the first 50 people who donate to Stand With Us this evening. So let me introduce you to our esteemed guests. Michael Dixon is the British-born Executive Director of Stand With Us in Israel and is dedicated to the Stand With Us mission of supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism around the world. Michael is a Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Communication of Bar Ilan University. In 2016, he was listed as the 14th most influential Jew on Twitter. He is the 2019 winner of the B'nai Zion Prize, and in 2020, he was listed on the Global Jewish 100. He lives in Israel with his wife and his 5 children. Dr. Naomi Baum consults and facilitates workshops on resilience building in Israel and around the world. She created the Building Resilience Intervention, an evidence-based resilience model that has been applied widely in Israel and abroad. She was director of the Resilience Unit at the Israel Psychotrauma Center, Mativ, and is the author of several previous books. She lives in Israel with her husband and is mother of 7 and grandmother of 20. And lastly, our host for this evening, Miri Eisen. Miri served in the Israeli intelligence community and retired from active duty at the rank of full colonel in 2004. Over her 20-year career in the military, she served in various capacities in combat and military intelligence. Miri was the Israeli Prime Minister's international media advisor from the Second Lebanon War until the end of 2007. Over the last 15 years, Miri has been one of Israel's main presenters, speaking on regional geopolitics and security-related issues in the media worldwide. And with this, I hand over to Miri.
What a pleasure, and Sarah, thank you so much. I'd like to welcome everybody again, and I'd like to say good evening to Naomi and to Michael. Good evening to you both.
Thank you, Miri. It's great to be with you. I would like to thank everyone who's joining us this evening all across the UK, and of course to Sarah Sherrod and our wonderful Stand With Us UK team for the amazing work that they do.
So what I'd like to do is have a conversation with the two of you. It's kind of fun because I'm in the book, but that's a spoiler. Naomi, I'd first like to ask you what to me was the obvious question. How do you and Michael know each other, and how did you get this idea to put together this book?
Well, good evening, Miri. Good evening, Michael. And let's put it right on the table. This book was Michael's idea. And when he was getting started, he came to visit me at the Resilience Unit of Mativ, where I was the director of the unit. I had started it and directed it. And we had a long conversation, a very good conversation about resilience. And then he disappeared, and we didn't hear from each other for a couple of years. And then I got a phone call a few years later, after I had actually left the trauma center and was freelancing and consulting on my own. And Michael said, I have this idea. I've had this idea for a very long time to write a book, and it's just not getting off the ground. How about if you join me? I think if I have a partner, it will happen. And you are the right partner for me. So I quickly agreed, because it was an offer I couldn't resist, meeting all sorts of interesting people, including Miri Eisen, and the rest is history. So we wrote this book together, interviewing 14 different people and looking at the keys to resilience. Let me use this question as an opportunity to talk for just a couple minutes about what we mean when we talk about resilience. Resilience is a term very close to my heart that I have been working with for over 20 years. And the idea behind resilience is that we look at the resources that a person has, what he does well, what is going right for him, what are his strengths. Very often in psychology, and I am a psychologist, we have been known to look at the cup that's half empty. What's missing? What's wrong? Where's the psychopathology? And the field of resilience actually turns that on its head. It sits very nicely in the field of positive psychology. And we look at what's going right for people. And the interesting thing is how people overcome tremendous odds, how people are able to deal with very difficult situations, not unlike the difficult situation that we are faced with now in COVID-19. In any case, in our book, what we did is we analyzed the stories of these 14 very interesting people who had very difficult challenges in their lives. And we unearthed or uncovered or excavated the keys to their resilience. And we grouped them in 3 categories. And those categories we called the keys to resilience. So the first key that we unearthed was the one called flexibility. And one of the things we know about resilient people is that if one thing is not working, they shift and they try something else. And I think we've all had that tried and tested during this last year. The ability to be flexible, to learn new things, to try new ways of being in the world. And people who are resilient are flexible. The second key to resilience is empathy. And empathy deals with emotions, the ability to experience and express a whole gamut of emotions. We might all want to be happy, but we're certainly not going to be happy all the time. And allowing ourselves to feel sad and to feel lonely and to feel anxious is part of resilience. Allowing ourselves to feel everything will allow us, even the more difficult feelings, will allow us to feel also the feelings of joy and happiness and excitement. So that is empathy. And the final key is the ability to find meaning in our lives, meaning making. What do we do, or what do we have in our life that gives us a sense of meaning, a significance? And this is really an important piece of resilience as well.
That's an amazing way that you just described so eloquently things that are so relevant in 2021 in the COVID year. But Michael, when you were thinking about this, none of us knew that there was going to be a pandemic. And I'm interested in understanding how your understanding of the social composition of Israeli society brought about who you chose. Naomi mentioned that you chose 14 people. You interviewed 14 people. How do you choose? How do you decide who you'd like to describe in the book?
So thank you for hosting us, Miri, first of all. I mean, it's been such a pleasure and such an amazing journey, and it really was a journey for us. I see this as a love letter to Israelis. And the subtitle of the book after Isresilience is What Israelis Can Teach the World. And so we set about meeting a range of diverse Israelis from right across the country, men and women, black and white, Jewish, Arab, Druze, immigrants from Africa, from the Soviet Union, from Yemen and others. Our youngest interviewee was in his 30s. Our oldest was in her 90s. And so in the book, we set out the keys to Isresilience and then interview these 14 different personalities and extrapolate from their stories how they personify the keys to Isresilience. And we wouldn't have time and for me to mention all of the 14 stories, and then no one would read the book. But I will mention some of the notable ones, because we met people like Natan Sharansky, obviously the famed political prisoner from the Soviet Union, human rights campaigner. We drilled down into what kept him going in the Gulag and how he then transitioned to life in Israel, very different from obviously what he had known prior to that. We met Radir Mareh, who is the first Druze TV news anchor for a major Israeli TV station, and who also later became the first female Druze member of Knesset. We spoke to her about how her traditional community views women and how she was able to break barriers in order to get to where she wanted to get to. We met Avigdor Kahalani, the injured military hero of the Yom Kippur War. He told us how he falsified his medical records after a terrible tank injury where he was suffered severe burns in order to get back into service, which was the meaning that drove him in his life. And that ended up having him be in the right place at the right time in a pivotal battle in the Yom Kippur War. And we met some famous people and some not so famous people. Nadav Ben Yehuda, who is a record-setting ice climber. I didn't know anything about ice climbing before we wrote this book. He abandoned a climb to reach the top of Everest in order to save a Turkish climber, and then risked his life in order to try and bring the two of them down from that peak. And in doing so, he eventually was honored with the Presidential Medal of Honor. We spoke to Noam Gershoni, who is the man who fell from the sky. He overcame a horrific Apache helicopter crash injury to become eventually Israel's first Paralympic gold medalist in the London 2012 Games. So what we try to do through these different chapters is tell different aspects of Israel's story, to look at different aspects of Israeli society, and yet keep true to those keys to Isresilience. The idea that Israelis have this unique resilience, the ability to remain and bounce forward rather than bounce back. Because as the psychology literature teaches us, you're never the same once you go through something, a tragedy or a terrible incident. You can move ahead, but it still remains with you. And so we were able to see up close and personal how these amazing, incredible individuals were able to face challenges and reach heights and learn from them in doing so.
And what's amazing is the way that you both shared this in this book. As we've said, highly recommended. I think that it's the kind of book that gives people strength. Naomi, you're a seasoned psychologist. As you said, you were working in resilience before. It wasn't an arena that you were unfamiliar with. So what were you surprised by while you were writing the book, while you were researching and meeting these different people?
Well, it's interesting. What surprises me always when I meet people, even though I know that most of us, most of the time are resilient, it's still an amazing, it's extraordinary. And there's a term that's used, a psychologist, a very well-known psychologist in the field of resilience. Her name is Ann Maston from Minneapolis, Minnesota. She talks about resilience as ordinary magic. And I can't think of a better term to use. It's ordinary because most people are resilient. It's magic because it really is magical how people can pick themselves up from the most difficult situations and move on. And as Michael said, and I always love Michael sounds like a psychologist because he's been hanging around me for a long time. That notion of of bouncing forward is a term that was used by a woman named Frimet Walsh, and it's a wonderful term as well, because we always talk about how when somebody goes through something bad, we hope that they will bounce back. Bouncing back being a good thing, coming back into your life. And what we're talking about when we're talking about bouncing forward is recognizing that things are never going to return exactly to the way they were. And you come back to the situation with added perspective, added value, and the ability to appreciate that. And I think the surprising thing for me was how when people like Rabbi Lau or Sherry Mandel told their very difficult, tragic, sad stories. Rabbi Lau was a child in the Holocaust. He was in the concentration camps for 3 years. He started off as 5 years old. He finished when he was 8. When he was telling us the story, he was crying. And it was incredible to me. This was a story that had happened more than 70 years ago. And he must have told that story hundreds of times, written about it, and yet each time, again, as he told it from his heart, and he experienced those heartfelt feelings. And at the same time, we had plenty of laughs. And the same was true for Sherry Mandel. She lost her son through very tragic circumstances in a terrorist attack. And she talked about him with tears in his eye, with tears in her eyes. But we laughed our way through that interview. So that ability to kind of go back and forth, to feel the pain, and then to just laugh about all sorts of things was just incredible and very, very life affirming.
When you tell that, and I listen to that, and I'm thinking of the 14 people that you depict inside the book, Michael, you deal with the challenges of presenting Israel to the world day in and day out. So what do you think makes Israel's resilience unique? I'll even put it otherwise. Are we unique? Are we different? Do you think we are different?
So I do think we're different, and I do think we're unique. And I think that's our contention in the book. There's something specifically resilient about the Israeli people. There's a steel in their spirit. There's a strength in their DNA. There's a metal just waiting to be tested. I moved here from the UK 15 years ago. And, you know, to live in Israel for any period of time is to bear witness to a lot. I moved just as the Second Lebanon War in 2006 was wrapping up. I remember being interviewed by the Mirror newspaper and the Guardian newspaper. And they wanted to interview me because the question was, why would any Brit want to move to a war zone? And so when we experience a lot in this country. And when we open the book, actually, Naomi and I both take a chapter to give a personal reflection. And I talk about the day when a rocket fell fairly near to our home. And, you know, you do what you need to do. So first thing in the morning, it happened, and we rush our kids together and we get to the safe room. And then pretty soon after that, the texts start coming in. You know, you're responding to friends and family back home. You're saying, you know, they're saying, how are you? And we're saying, we're fine. How are you doing? We're fine. Another one comes in, how are you doing? Oh, we're fine. I should be careful what I'm saying because my parents are watching, and actually they were one of the people who would have been texting me. But you say you're fine, but are you actually fine? That's the question. You know, how can these events not affect you adversely? On another occasion, my daughter had her birthday party, and it was rudely interrupted while these girls were on a bouncy castle in the garden. We heard a rocket alert siren above, and she and her friends, I just saw this vision from the house of these girls running in, and us then having to take them down to the bomb shelter and sing happy birthday, keeping them calm in the bomb shelter, you know, to kind of soothe their nerves. So it's impossible not to have anxiety or insecurity when faced like events like this, even if we think that we're fine. And yet, these are the things that help build resilience. You know, when they poll people in these various happiness surveys, Israel always comes out near the top. So the question is, you know, are Israelis unaffected detrimentally by all the threats, the terror, the rockets, the volatility of the region, the potential for conflict to intensify in the course of a day? Are they unaffected? No, categorically not. So yes, there is something special about Israel. And part of it is in the upbringing as well. We deal with that in the book a little. You know, we talk about that can-do attitude that's actually inculcated and taught from childhood. They say to kids, Hakol ani yachol, you know, I can do anything. And so Israelis may not be so good at long-term planning, but they're pretty good at getting things done in the moment. And Naomi spoke about that flexibility, one of our keys to Isresilience. And you see that even now in the vaccination rollout. My first vaccination was in a dance studio, refurbished, and my second vaccination was in an art gallery. So Israelis have the ability to be empathetic, to be, you know, they let you know how they feel. No one ever said to an Israeli, you know, tell me how you feel. You always know. And that we think is a good thing when you are going through something, to live in with those emotions rather than to compartmentalize it and put it aside. And Israelis are flexible in the way they act, and Israelis make meaning out of life. Life means a lot here in a very special way, especially when you consider the threats. And we quote Viktor Frankl in the book, a Holocaust survivor who was the father of logotherapy, who teaches us that, if you have meaning in your life, you can withstand just about anything. So everyone can be resilient. It's not that Israelis have the monopoly on resilience. And it's our hope that people can learn from Israelis and that they'll learn how to build these skills from the Israelis that we meet in the book.
But that makes it in its sense as I'm thinking about that. I was born in the States. You were born in the UK. Naomi, I think you also were born overseas. So all of us are actually Olim, and you made Aliyah. We all did. And many of the people featured in the book, including myself, are Olim. Naomi, do you think there's a difference between Olim who immigrate to Israel and between born Israelis when it comes to resilience?
I think actually that they're both resilient, the native-born Israelis and the Olim. I think that the native-born Israelis often don't see it as resilience. They take it as something matter of course. This is the way we are. This is the way we live our lives. Of course we're resilient. And I think that the Olim, the newcomers to Israel, often have a little bit better perspective and are able to appreciate a little bit more just how resilient Israelis are. But I think that by and large, you see resilience in both communities. And you're right, many of our interviewees are Olim. I haven't stopped to think about that until you just now asked that question. But we have many Olim in the book. Maybe it's even half and half, 50% Olim and 50% native Israelis. But that's not surprising because Israel is a country with immigrants. It's an immigrant country. So that wouldn't be surprising, I suppose, that we have so many Olim in the book. But I would say as a whole, the resilience that's shown in both groups is both remarkable and ordinary.
And I would just add, Mary, if I may,
Sure.
in addition to the immigrants, we have some Israelis who've lived here for generations, and then also actually Margalit Zinati, who is a nonagenarian who has lived here all her life, but not just all her life. She dates her family history back to Second Temple times. When the Second Temple was destroyed, the majority of Jewry were expelled, but some Jews actually fled, and a lot of them fled north. And she lives in a town called Pika'in in the Galil. And she's known as the keeper of the torch because she and her family have maintained Jewish traditions from that time. It goes to speak to our ancestral roots in this country. And that was an incredible story to tell. She's not Sephardi, she's not Ashkenazi. She is just Jewish, Israeli, living here. And Miri, of course, we feature you in the book. I wonder if you'll allow me to turn the tables for a moment because you very kindly allowed us to tell your resilient story in the book. And many Brits watching this will, of course, know you as Israel's face to the world in some pretty tough times on BBC News and Sky News. And we had a wide-ranging discussion. And one of the things we spoke about with you for the book was the concept of national resilience. And Israelis very much feel like they belong to a community. So I wonder, in your opinion, how much of a difference does that make to their ability to be resilient, to feel that sense of belonging and community?
From my point of view, that's the whole thing. The whole thing is that we belong here. One of the amazing aspects of Israeli society is there is no such thing as somebody not being taken care of. And I'm not talking about homeless. I'm talking about that resilience, especially within our national companionship, where we take care of our neighbors. We're also very nosy and we're in their face, but we take care of them and we wonder about them and we hug them. It's at the basis of many of the different communal type of towns and villages that we have in Israel that are so unique in a kibbutz or in a moshav. But that idea of community in Israel can be in the neighborhood, it's on the street, it's in the classroom. It's something that you really do feel very involved. You know that somebody will be there to help you. In addition, we're very family in Israel. And it's funny because all of us talking to each other right now, we are Olim. And I'm one of those that my parents made Aliyah, and they're not watching right now, but perhaps some of their friends are. And my family in Israel, was the Anglo-Saxon Olim, who came around the same time, and we became a family here. So it's that companionship, that very strong family sense, which really gives us a backbone. You know that somebody's going to be there for you, with you, and that's what really pushes you forward. Naomi and Michael, I'd love to be able to ask you some additional wonderful questions that I've gotten from the audience. So if it's okay with you, I am now going to ask a few questions that we've gotten from the audience. We're good with that.
Sounds
All right.
good.
Okay, so I'm going to ask as we go on, and I'm asking in their name. So Dr. Rafael Zarum, and I hope I said his name correctly, says each chapter focused on the resilience of individuals, but the stories reveal beautifully how important others, families, community, professionals helped and supported them. So is the capacity for resilience more of a group than an individual dynamic? Naomi, would you like to start with
Yeah,
that?
I'm going to take that question. I think the questioner really, he's got it. Because when I talk about the 3 keys to resilience, I say that these are the 3 keys that we chose to focus on. But really, there's a 4th key, and that's when we talk about support. We talk about social support, family support, community support, and there is no question that it goes hand in hand with those individual keys. The reason I think that we decided to focus on the individual keys, we felt these were the take-home messages, the things that people could really have some kind of control over in their own lives, things that they could perhaps think about, maybe do differently or behave differently in their own lives. Certainly we can work on building community and building social supports, but that may be a little bit more complicated. But there's no question, and research bears that out, that probably the single most important feature in any individual's resilience is the amount of support and the level of support that he receives from social networks, whether it be family, friends, community. So
That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
So really, thank you, Dr. Zarum, for the question, Naomi, for that answer. Our next question is coming from, I think, somebody that certainly our audience should know well, Colonel Richard Kemp, and I'd really like to say thank you to Richard Kemp for much of what he does, but what he asks is, he says, congratulations on your excellent book, which I hope everyone here will read from cover to cover. I think that the question will be for Michael. The question is, do you think the book can have an effect on the consciousness of the British public?
Well, that's a wonderful question. There's a caliber to these questioners, by the way, Dr. Zarum, wonderful person, and Colonel Kemp, Colonel like you, Mary, and a wonderful, wonderful supporter of the state of Israel. Can this book make a difference to the consciousness of the British public? I mean, I would hope so. I hope so, because I mentioned earlier, I think this is a love letter to Israelis. And actually, one of the endorsements that we have from the book is from former vice presidential candidate, Senator Joe Lieberman. And he says in his endorsement that, you know, we've been known by many names, the chosen people, the people of the book, more recently, the startup nation. But it would be wonderful, he says, if Israelis would be known for their Isresilience. And actually, that would be wonderful. I always say when I speak to groups on behalf of Stand With Us and we're talking about Israelis, the most important letter I in the word Israeli is the not the I at the beginning, it's the I at the end. You know, Israeli rather than just Israel. I think people make the difference and people connect to people. And so I think there is much to learn from Israelis. We know that Israel is a country you know, more sinned against than sinning, much maligned in the world, but unfairly. And the people of Israel are the first to help in a humanitarian crisis. They are peace-loving, they are wonderful, they are diverse, they have a lot to say for themselves. And so for me, the idea that, you know, in W.H. Smith, which won't mean much to you, Miri or Naomi, but, you know, is on most high streets, I think, still in the UK. The idea that W.H. Smith is stocking a book called Isresilience, What Israelis Can Teach the World, says to me that, you know what, perhaps ordinary Brits will pick this up, learn the lessons of resilience, and find a newfound respect for the Israelis who they learn that from.
That's absolutely amazing. I'm going to continue in that sense with a question from dear Loretta Cash. Hi, Loretta, who is the chair of Stand With Us UK. And I myself have been hosted, and it's lovely to know that you're here. And she asks, how do you feel that Israeli resilience has been reflected in the way that Israelis have coped with the pandemic, which is such a relevant question right now? Naomi, perhaps you can start to address this, and then I'll go on with Michael.
Sure. So, as you all know, the pandemic has hit worldwide, and certainly we in Israel have been very much affected. We're just now coming out of our third lockdown, and most kids are still not back to school. So parents of children, school-aged children, and I just spent a snow day with several of those school-aged children who are my grandchildren. Parents of those kids are really kind of at wit's end. But nevertheless, we see in Israel both the tremendous amount of support there is in the community and the coming together and the flexibility, how people have adapted to working at home and how working from a distance, and how people have managed to learn how to get their kids onto Zoom and distance learning, how teachers have learned to do distance learning. So we've seen lots of features of resilience that I'm sure you see in the UK as well. One of the things I think that we're particularly proud of is the speed with which our government procured for us the vaccines. And there's a lot of discussion about how that actually happened and why we were so lucky to get vaccines early on in the game. But I think that that is also a test to a tribute, I think, to forward thinking ahead, and also the willingness to actually invest in the people of Israel on the part of the leaders of this country. So I guess that's my answer. There's not an easy answer for resilience during the times of the pandemic, but those are a couple of my thoughts.
I would just quickly add to that, we spoke about bouncing forward, and I mentioned that resilience is not an exclusively Israeli trait, obviously. But I do think that when the chips are down in this country, the people meet that challenge, and we're used to doing it. And for unfortunate reasons, we're used to doing it time and time again. And so I think that Israelis saw COVID as another battle, of which we've seen so many, to be fought and won. Let's hope we will win it, and we'll win it collectively. And I would also say that we didn't know about the pandemic, obviously, when we were writing this book, but I don't think it could have come out at a more opportune time. And I think these are lessons that people can learn from. And I think that we all deserve some inspiration in our lives as well. And hopefully that's what this message will give them.
It's a lovely thing as you're saying that. And I think that there's a lovely follow-up question from the audience now from Sylvie, who asks, how do you teach resilience to people who never had to face difficult times?
I think
Naomi, are you going to dive in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, that kind of takes us back to the previous question about Israelis and Michael's response, that we're used to dealing with crisis. So when this crisis hit, we've never had a crisis like this. We had to pivot, we had to switch, we had to be flexible in our thinking, but we know that feeling of being in an emergency situation. We know that feeling. And I think that prepared us in a way that perhaps the public in the UK wasn't prepared. But now that you've been in it for a year, I think looking and considering some of the things that we are talking about, the importance of flexibility, the importance of being aware of our feelings and sharing them first of all, sharing them with ourselves, sharing them with the people around us, understanding that we don't always have to keep a stiff upper lip. We can let down and we can cry and we can say things are tough, and that's okay too. And we are going to get through this. And the final piece is really where we find the hope. Hope very often comes from the meaning we make in our lives. So if we are stuck at home, what can we do that gives us a feeling of hope, that breeds hope? Because we know that hope is also an essential part of resilience. So I hope that those are some of the messages that you can take away from reading our book into your own lives that can be helpful in building resilience.
And
So
Mary, can I pick up from that?
I'm going to let you in a sec, Michael. I'm just going to add in, because there's a lovely follow-up to the follow-up, and I'd love you to address that, is do you think that Israelis and Jews have become more resilient because we've always been under attack?
So without a doubt, I do believe that. And actually, this is a question I would turn back to you, Mary, because when we interviewed you, one of the things we spoke about was the idea of perceiving yourself as a survivor rather than a victim. And I'm talking about Israelis in general, those who've undergone tremendous tragedy or challenge, and those who just live in Israel. There's a survivor mentality rather than a victim mentality. I wonder if you'd reflect on that for a moment when we come to this question.
It's a fascinating aspect to think about right now. So everybody right now, you're inside your houses. We've all been closed in for a year. I don't think any of us right now in this year of Corona have thought of ourselves as victims, perhaps except for the, sadly, people who have passed away, but we're all trying to survive it. And I think that it gives a different mode. Victimhood is that sense where you feel that somebody else is responsible and you don't take responsibility in that sense for your own future. And there's no question that certainly post World War II, and one of the most amazing aspects for me, learning about Holocaust victims, is that overwhelmingly, certainly in the state of Israel, they weren't victims. They were survivors. They didn't want to be acted as victims, as people that needed to be felt sorry for. They survived. They went forward. In a funny way, Naomi, they did do stiff upper lip, but it was what helped them go forward. And there's no question that our Jewish and Israeli history have given us a very strong backbone into surviving and going forward. Sadly, that whole aspect of the victimhood survival aspect is part of a much bigger issue when it comes to Israel and the world and the way that we are perceived. But again, I agree with the two of you. It's also our strength. It's our hidden strength that doesn't always get understood in the right way.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to go on in that sense. One of the questions that's coming up for both of you, and I don't know if together or each apart, would there be an additional book in the offing?
Well, I can tell you that there were many stories that we were unable to tell. We kind of give ourselves a disclaimer in the opening of the book, which is to say that any Israeli could have interviewed for this book. And there were, many, I can tell you, that we would have loved to have featured and weren't able to. So there is definitely more material. I'll put it that way. Naomi, what do you say?
I say if Michael is game, I'm game. And you heard it right now. Breaking news.
So that's like a verbal contract live.
That's absolutely one that afterwards will be binding in that sense. So perhaps instead of, as we can see so clearly, the Israel resilience that is in that resilience aspect, is there additional aspects that you think that you would like to dig into when it comes to Israeli society? Michael?
Go ahead,
Michael.
Ladies
I had
first.
an answer before you said Israeli society. There are actually some things that I'm interested in digging into a little bit more that we didn't look at, and that has to do with people who are born with handicaps. That has to do with people who are overcoming illnesses. And I don't think though either of those areas are particularly Israeli. It could be that we will find when we interview these people that there's something particularly Israeli about the response. But those are two areas. But truthfully, Michael and I haven't really spoken about this, so he's probably
we're having a live conversation now, but I'm actually thinking about the aspects of how Israel builds resilience and how those are at play in the world. So when Israel goes out and helps people in the world, what lessons they are drawing on from their own experience. So we'll watch this space. We'll get back to you.
That'll be a wonderful thing for all of us to be able to see. So I would like to thank the two of you for a fascinating conversation. I want to hope that our viewers really got the chance to be able to understand better what you have brought out in this book, how important it is, but also how readable, and as you said, in its own way, it's a feel-good book at the right time on the right subject. So Naomi and Michael, thank you so, so much. And I'm going to hand back to Sarah in the UK.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi and Michael, for taking us on this gorgeous journey with you and for inspiring us to dig deep and find our own inner strength and contemplate our own resilience, especially given these challenging times. I love the phrase bouncing forward. I'll be using that one. And thank you, Miri. You are a beloved Israel educator and have spoken to thousands of Stand With Us students. So thank you for hosting our event this evening and for all that you do. And lastly, thank you to our hundreds of guests for joining us this evening. I urge you all to read the book. You don't need to go to the W.H. Smith's website, as Michael suggested, because we have 50 signed copies of the book to give away. W.H. Smith do not have signed copies, and we have 50 signed copies of the book to give away. All donations will go to Stand With Us UK, where we are committed to ensuring that the next generation is equipped to fight anti-Semitism and challenge misinformation about Israel. Your generosity will help us to continue in our mission of using education as the road to peace. So I thank Michael, Naomi and Miri once again, and I wish you all a good night.